When I observe the moment Peter Parker is bitten by the spider, I do not see a simple biological accident, nor the casual beginning of a heroic journey. I see instead what I have long chamado the awakening of the unconscious. In our psychic life, sudden events often serve as detonators for forces that have been quietly stored beneath the ego's fragile structure. The bite represents exactly this, a violent intrusion of repressed potential. It is as if the unconscious, tired of being ignored, forces its way into the young man's life through a symbolically charged moment. What awakens in Peter is not merely strength. What awakens is conflict. In my studies, I have noted that every trauma is a teacher, though often a cruel one. The spider, for Peter, functions almost as the emissary of a fate he never asked for. Its bite is abrupt, unexpected, and profoundly transformative, precisely the characteristics of events that break through the defenses of the psyche. Before the bite, he is a boy who feels insignificant, overlooked, and powerless. After it, he becomes someone who cannot ignore his own capabilities anymore, and it is in this forced confrontation with inner strength that his true psychological struggle begins. The trauma reveals possibilities, but it also reveals fears. You see, the powers that emerge after the bite are not simply gifts. They are metaphors for impulses, desires, and potentials that Peter had never permitted himself to acknowledge. All adolescents experience something similar. Sudden emotions, new sensations, instincts that feel too intense to control. Peter's transformation only exaggerates what is already universal. The unconscious erupts, bringing with it both fascination and terror. He must ask himself a question that many avoid. What am I capable of? And this question is frightening precisely because the answer threatens to dismantle the identity he had previously built. Many imagine that fear arises from danger, but in truth, fear often arises from our own greatness. I have witnessed countless individuals who sabotage themselves because their inner potential threatens to overwhelm them. This is the case with Peter. The powers force him to confront the duality that exists within every human being, the wish to be extraordinary and the fear of losing oneself in the process. The spider bite exposes this contradiction brutally, forcing him to navigate a landscape where responsibility, desire, and guilt collide. In this sense, the trauma is not just physical, it is existential. And yet, what fascinates me most is not the power itself, but Peter's immediate attempt to deny, hide, or rationalize it. This is a classic reaction of the ego when the unconscious becomes too loud. He seeks explanations, he seeks control, he seeks to return to the familiar structure of his previous self. But the unconscious, once awakened, does not return to silence so easily. The bite symbolizes the moment when Peter's psychic equilibrium shatters, making room for a new identity that he fears but cannot escape. The internal conflict is not a side effect. It is the core of his transformation. Therefore, the spider bite is not, in my interpretation, the beginning of a heroic narrative, but the beginning of a psychological one. It marks the moment when a young man becomes aware of forces that he does not fully understand and cannot yet manage. His journey from that point on is not about learning to fight villains. It is about learning to live with himself. The bite awakens instincts, responsibilities, desires, and guilt all at once. And as I have seen in my patients, it is precisely from this inner chaos that the true personality begins to emerge. Peter Parker does not become Spider-Man because of the bite. He becomes Spider-Man because the bite forces him to face who he truly is. As I observe Peter Parker, I immediately recognize the psychological tension that arises when an ordinary young man is suddenly forced to confront abilities far beyond the limits of what his ego was prepared to handle. You must understand, the ego is not designed to expand overnight. It is built slowly, shaped by childhood experiences, validations, disappointments, and social interactions. But Peter's transformation occurs too quickly. His unconscious awakens to a new sense of power, yet his ego remains that of a timid boy who never believed he deserved admiration. And so, rather than expanding to match his newfound potential, the ego retreats, frightened by its own sudden magnitude. Peter clings to the life of a regular teenager, not because it fits him, but because it protects him from the terror of what he might become if he fully embraced his abilities. This resistance is a classic defense mechanism. When an individual feels overwhelmed by impulses, talents, or desires that exceed what he believes he can control, he diminishes himself to maintain psychic equilibrium. Peter's insecurity is not weakness. It is a shield. It is the ego saying, "If I act small, I will remain safe." The more extraordinary his powers become, the more desperately he holds on to the familiarity of mediocrity. His constant self-doubt reflects this inner fragmentation. On one side, there is the surge of potency, the unconscious force craving expression, mastery, and the recognition of his heroic capacity. But on the other side lies the ego, shaped by years of social invisibility, bullying, and emotional deprivation. These early wounds created a self-image built around insufficiency. And when the self is built upon insufficiency, greatness becomes frightening. To accept greatness is to confront every moment one felt unworthy of it. Peter is not running from responsibility alone. He is running from the parts of himself he never learned to love. Every time Peter hesitates before taking action, it is not simply fear of danger. It is fear of identity. His avoidance, his modesty, even his humor serve as defenses that prevent him from confronting the overwhelming truth of who he could be. If he allowed his powers to define him, he would be forced to rewrite his entire psychic structure. A task the ego resists fiercely. His fragility is not an illusion. It is a deeply rooted narrative that he has relied upon for years, a narrative that feels safer than the uncertainty of transcendence. I often say that the greatest conflict in the human psyche is not between good and evil, but between potential and fear. In Peter's case, this conflict becomes almost mythic. His extraordinary abilities demand that he grow, but his ego demands that he stay small. He longs to protect others, yet he also longs to protect himself from the burden of becoming something exceptional. This tension explains why Peter frequently sabotages opportunities, relationships, and moments of triumph. Self-sabotage is simply the ego's attempt to restore a familiar emotional environment, even if that environment is painful. Ultimately, Peter Parker embodies the universal human struggle. We fear the greatness inside us because it threatens the identity we have built to survive. His fragility is the anchor that keeps him human, yet it is also the barrier he must overcome to truly become Spider-Man. And so, his story is not just the tale of a hero, but the tale of a young man wrestling with the terrifying possibility that he might actually be extraordinary. When I observe Peter Parker transforming into Spider-Man, I do not see simply a young man putting on a costume. I see a subject stepping into a psychic chamber where his forbidden impulses finally find expression. The mask allows him to release instincts that, in his everyday identity, he feels compelled to suppress. In Peter's ordinary life, he is timid, hesitant, almost apologetic for existing. Yet the moment he becomes Spider-Man, he moves with a confidence and assertiveness he otherwise denies himself. This is not the birth of a new self, but the liberation of an old one, long repressed, now granted a socially acceptable outlet through heroism. Spider-Man becomes the arena where Peter can finally breathe without fear of judgment. In my understanding, the mask functions as a symbolic boundary between what Peter allows himself to be and what he fears he may become. As Peter, he attempts to remain modest, invisible, harmless, an ego wrapped tightly in insecurity. But beneath this fragile ego lies a reservoir of potency, strength, anger, desire, ambition, the wish to be extraordinary. When he dons the suit, he gives form to these impulses, yet only within a controlled frame. Spider-Man is his compromise formation, a psychic negotiation where forbidden impulses are permitted to surface under the guise of duty and self-sacrifice. In this sense, he is both empowered and contained by the mask. What fascinates me most is that Peter insists on separating these two identities as if they were strangers sharing a single body. He does not allow himself to fully integrate the assertiveness of Spider-Man into his daily life, nor does he relinquish the vulnerability of Peter when performing heroic acts. This strict division reveals a fear of the self, specifically a fear that power will distort him, corrupt him, detach him from the ordinary human connections he cherishes. Thus, the mask becomes not a liberation alone, but also a prison. He can express his strength only in disguise, as if admitting it openly would shatter the fragile balance of his psyche. In my analysis, Spider-Man represents Peter's idealized active self, the version of him that dares to act, to intervene, to shape the world rather than endure it. But because Peter's ego feels unworthy of this power, the alter ego becomes inflated with responsibility. He treats his abilities not as gifts to enjoy, but as burdens he must constantly justify. This excess of responsibility reveals his deep fear that power and danger are inseparable. To him, every instinct toward greatness must be accompanied by guilt. Thus, the mask becomes a moral filter, allowing him to be strong only when the world demands it, never when he desires it. I must also observe that Spider-Man acts as a conduit for Peter's unconscious conflicts. The agility, the speed, the daring stunts across the city, these are expressions of freedom, of primal energy, of the id unleashed. Yet because they are expressed in service of others, Peter believes he remains morally safe. He does not recognize that within these acts lies a satisfaction of his own repressed wishes, to be seen, to be valued, to escape insignificance. The costume, therefore, becomes a socially approved disguise for his own craving to matter. Spider-Man is the figure who allows Peter to symbolically reclaim the power he felt denied throughout his early life. Ultimately, the tragedy and the brilliance of Peter Parker lie in this inner division. He sees Spider-Man as a tool, a role, a necessity, never as a natural extension of himself. He fears his potential more than he fears any villain, believing that embracing it might strip away the softness and humility he associates with his core identity. What he fails to understand is that true strength emerges only when these fragments of the self learn to coexist. The reconciliation of Peter and Spider-Man is not a heroic achievement, but a psychological one. The moment when he can finally say, without fear, "This power is mine, and I can wield it without losing who I am." When I examine Peter Parker's famous motto, "With great power comes great responsibility," I do not hear a simple moral teaching. I hear a command, a demand, a voice of judgment. To my ears, this phrase functions as the super-ego at its most severe, the internal authority that reminds the subject of his failures, his debts, and the punishment he believes he deserves. For Peter, this line is not an inspiration. It is a verdict. The moment he repeats it, his desires contract, his spontaneity diminishes, and his entire psychic life becomes organized around guilt. It is not the power that scares him. It is the fear of being judged as unworthy to possess it. The guilt that haunts him originates not in the present, but in the moment of Uncle Ben's death. In psychoanalytic terms, this becomes his original trauma, the point where his desire and his fantasy collided in the most devastating way. He wanted freedom, excitement, recognition, and on the very night he sought these things, tragedy emerged. The mind, always eager to find meaning in its pain, draws a cruel conclusion. My desire caused the disaster. And once the subject internalizes such an idea, he spends the rest of his life distrusting his impulses, sabotaging his potential, and punishing himself for even daring to want more. Thus, the phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility," becomes a psychic chain. It binds Peter to an ideal of constant vigilance, self-sacrifice, and emotional repression. He believes that the only way to redeem his past is by denying himself any possibility of joy. His relationships, his ambitions, his dreams, all of them become secondary to the need to atone. I have seen many patients who, after a traumatic event, confuse responsibility with self-erasure. Peter is no different. He does not feel responsible. He feels guilty. And guilt, when misinterpreted, paralyzes instead of guiding. The paradox is that Peter's guilt does not protect him, it weakens him. When desire is suffocated by a tyrannical superego, the subject becomes divided, conflicted, and inwardly exhausted. Peter throws himself into saving others, not always from compassion, but from the unconscious hope that one day he will finally forgive himself. Yet the guilt never subsides, because the trauma was never symbolized, never spoken, never elaborated, never truly confronted. Instead, it becomes a shadow that follows him in every rooftop leap, every fight, every choice he believes he must make. It is essential to understand that Peter's fear of his own potential is not fear of harming others. It is fear of repeating the emotional catastrophe that shaped his life. The more powerful he becomes as Spider-Man, the more Peter feels the pressure of the superego tightening around him, whispering that failure is inevitable and punishment is deserved. This is why he hesitates, why he doubts himself, why he retreats from opportunities that could bring him happiness or fulfillment. His true enemy is not any villain. It is the guilt that has fused itself with his identity. If Peter is ever to overcome this paralyzing force, he must reinterpret responsibility not as punishment, but as a path toward individuation. Responsibility should guide desire, not suffocate it. When he understands that power is not inherently dangerous, but simply an extension of who he is, then the trauma will cease to dominate him. Only then will the phrase that once tormented him transform into something liberating. A reminder, not of what he failed to do, but of what he is capable of becoming when he no longer fears his own strength. When I observe Peter's long list of enemies, I do not see mere criminals or monsters. I see fragments of his own psyche externalized and dramatized. In psychoanalysis, we call this projection, the process by which the individual attributes disowned impulses to the outside world. Peter, frightened by the intensity of his own emotions, gives them form in adversaries who seem to emerge from the shadows of New York, but in truth originate in the shadows of his unconscious. By fighting them, he is fighting himself, attempting to master the very drives he fears will consume him. Take, for instance, the villains who embody uncontrolled ambition, men who, like Norman Osborn, cannot tolerate their own limitations and therefore attempt to surpass human boundaries. Peter recognizes in them a reflection of his own potential for excess. He knows that he too possesses immense power, the kind that could corrupt if left unchecked. Thus, when he battles these figures, he's struggling with the anxiety that comes from feeling too capable, too close to the temptation of greatness that could easily slip into tyranny. His enemies reveal the same internal struggle I have seen in many young men who fear their own talents. Then there are the foes who represent unbridled rage, individuals who allow their anger to dictate their actions without restraint. Peter, by contrast, desperately tries to maintain composure, often repressing his frustration, sadness, and helplessness. But repressed emotion never disappears. It merely seeks another outlet. When he faces villains fueled by fury, He is confronting the rage he refuses to acknowledge within himself. In this way, the fight becomes a symbolic ritual, a way to keep his darker impulses outside his identity, where he can punch them rather than feel them. Some adversaries embody Peter's fear of losing control. Creatures transformed by experiments gone wrong or by the unpredictable nature of power mirror Peter's terror that his own spider-like abilities could one day evolve beyond his command. I see in these confrontations the classic human dread of becoming the very thing one fears, a theme deeply rooted in the unconscious. Peter's insistence on restraint is, in fact, a defense against the possibility that he could become monstrous if he ever surrendered fully to his potential. There are also villains who symbolize the parts of Peter that crave recognition, superiority, or freedom from responsibility, desires he suppresses in the name of morality. These figures act without guilt, without hesitation, satisfying urges Peter denies himself. When he combats them, he is punishing the impulses he considers unacceptable. In this sense, the villain is not only the projected fear, but also the punished desire, a dual function that creates a psychological loop. He destroys externally what he cannot accept internally. Ultimately, Peter's battles are not merely heroic adventures. They are a continuous and exhausting dialogue with his unconscious. Each villain forces him to look at a part of himself he wishes were not there. And yet, paradoxically, without these enemies, he would never truly understand the complexity of his own mind. His greatest strength is not the ability to climb walls or sense danger, but the courage, often reluctant, often painful, to confront his own shadows. For in defeating them, he slowly learns to integrate the pieces of himself he once feared. When I observe Peter's relationships with MJ and Gwen, I see far more than romantic longing. I see the trembling center of his psychic conflict. To be loved is, for him, a terrifying invitation to be fully known. Love threatens to expose not only his desires, but also the fractures he desperately hides. In both women, Peter encounters the possibility of being seen beyond the mask, and that possibility terrifies him more than any villain he has ever faced. Each time Peter approaches intimacy, he is confronted with a deep unconscious fear. What if they see the real me? This fear predates the costume, predates the powers, predates the tragedy of Uncle Ben. It is rooted in adolescence, that vulnerable period when the ego is still soft, still forming, still wounded by every rejection or insecurity. For Peter, love is dangerous because it demands emotional visibility, something his fragile ego does not believe it can endure. MJ and Gwen both symbolize something that challenges him profoundly: acceptance. And acceptance is something Peter does not trust. He assumes that if someone truly sees him, his doubts, his resentment, his anger, his guilt, they will turn away. His fear of intimacy is therefore not a fear of losing them, but a fear of being exposed as imperfect, flawed, and deeply conflicted. The mask hides much more than his identity. It hides his fear of insufficiency. Whenever Peter distances himself from love to protect them, he is also protecting himself from this unbearable psychological exposure. He tells himself that danger is the reason, that villains might hurt them. But beneath this rationalization lies a deeper truth. Peter fears that emotional nakedness is more dangerous than physical threat. To love someone demands a kind of surrender that he does not yet feel strong enough to give. MJ and Gwen also activate a conflict between his two selves. Peter, the insecure young man, and Spider-Man, the extraordinary figure. When he loves them, these two selves collide, demanding integration. But Peter has spent so much time separating his identities that merging them feels impossible. Loving someone requires unity of self, and Peter fears he has none to offer. How can he be loved fully when he does not feel whole within himself? Thus, his relationships become a mirror reflecting his deepest psychological struggle, the fear of being known and the longing to connect. He loves intensely, but he retreats just as intensely. And this is the tragedy I observe in him, that his greatest power is not his strength or agility, but his capacity to love, a capacity he repeatedly suppresses because he believes that vulnerability is a weakness. In truth, it is the most human part of him, and the part he fears the most.